We did it. We made it to the last chapter. I hope you've enjoyed this book, and I hope you've learned a lot from the book and from the class in general. In this last chapter, he's trying to tie together the impact of globalization and how that's going to impact any of the economic systems a country may have. So let's do hundreds of years of economic history in 2 slides. So he describes in the last chapter a history of globalization. And so he goes back to the 1200s where you have Marco Polo coming in from Europe into Central Asia. And he says that China could be said to be the center of the global economic system in the 1300s. So why is he mentioning this? Is to basically convince you that globalization is not new. It's very typical for people to think whatever's happening in their time period is new and the worst ever. So the first principle we want to realize is that globalization as a thing has been around for a while. It comes and goes, it ebbs and flows, but it is not a new phenomenon. Now, when we think about the Industrial Revolution, that's often one time when we think that there is the beginning of globalization. But really what it is a deepening of international economic integration. Even in the mercantilist years preceding the Industrial Revolution, there was a lot of global trade. There might have been a lot of protectionism, but there was also a lot of international economic integration. And so as we move into Industrial Revolution, as capitalism is rising, we see a deepening of this integration. And it's largely because of things like technology is allowing more transportation and communications to happen more quickly, which brings people together. Governments are seeing the benefit to economic trade, so they are actually lowering barriers to trade. And at the time, this would have been when England was in the ascendancy, they had their pound tied to the gold, so there was really a true gold standard internationally at this point in time. However, the happy trend of economic integration is terribly interrupted by World War I, the Great Depression, and World War II. After World War I ended, a desire for punishment or revenge seemed to rule the day, and reparations were demanded from Germany. And while it's a complicated issue, certainly one of the factors that helped contribute to World War II, or should I say the rise of Hitler and eventually World War II, is the economic devastation imposed on Germany by these reparations. And so as World War II ends, there's a recognition that we do not want all of this horror of world wars and economic destruction to continue. And so there is a decision by the powers that be to try and create a system of harmony as opposed to conflict. And that's where you get the Bretton Woods system. It's formed post-World War II, and you get your various institutions like the IMF, International Monetary Fund. Among other duties, one of its functions is to help a country if it finds itself in an economic crisis. If it's unable to get a hold of foreign currency to make any payments, they can get help and assistance from the IMF with conditionalities that they make some reforms to their policies. At the time after World War II, they were unable to get an institution off the ground that we now know as the World Trade Organization. They just weren't able to get all the agreements in place. In the process of trying to get it, they had made some agreements on lowering tariffs. And so right after World War II, they actually went with this, I'm not sure I should call it an institution, but this organization called GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and they used the process of negotiating lower tariffs through GATT to eventually in the 1990s create the institution they wanted, the World Trade Organization. It's intended to be a place where countries can come together and negotiate lowering tariffs and any other conflicts they might have regarding trade in a multilateral way so that we can all be playing on a even playing field. Post-World War II, they also created the IBRD, the International Bank of Reconstruction and Development, because Europe had been destroyed and needed to be rebuilt. The IBRD is one of several parts that all together make up the World Bank today. And the World Bank's mission is to help countries develop economically. And then also, post World War II, they created a pseudo gold standard based on the US dollar, and that lasted until 1971. And so we have the powers that be here creating a system that is supposed to be one of cooperation and one that is not just might makes right, but one of harmony so that everybody is benefiting from it. And so that was an attempt to encourage and deepen globalization. So as we come into the end of the 20th century, the Bretton Woods system has been a success, and we see globalization accelerating even more because of these three reasons: technological progress, the end of communism, and deregulation. Historically, the barrier to the flow of goods and services internationally has been the cost of transportation and the coordination it takes to align production and distribution over vast distances. And so what we see at the end of the 20th century is some technological developments that have actually lowered these costs, allowing globalization to increase. So for example, you have cargo ships that are standard in size that with the well, it's actually the containers that are standard in size, which you can stack on to these cargo ships that are then more easily unloaded by cranes, and they are unloaded directly to trains and trucks for delivery, lowering the cost of transportation. You have global supply chains now managed and optimized with computers and internet for staying connected. Financial capitals flow very easily given the computerized global financial markets of today. And so basically, quoting from the book, in short, technological change has rendered geographical distance relatively inconsequential as a barrier to commerce. The second factor that has increased globalization in the end of the 20th century was the end of communism. Certainly we have seen China transitioning from communism since 1979. They're somewhere along that spectrum. Russia did a much more, or should I say the Soviet Union, did a much more abrupt end to communism in 1991 and became Russia. So that has increased the portion of the world's resources production that is in the global market. Soviet Union had not really been part of the global market prior to this, and that this trend has amplified as other nations who were in the sphere of China and Russia have also moved into the global market. In addition, if we look through the 80s or so, these institutions that we mentioned, the IMF and the World Bank, were pushing something called the Washington Consensus. This was the idea that to be economically successful, you needed to be fully integrated into the global economy. And so the third one he mentions is deregulation as far as factors that contribute to increased globalization in the 80s and 90s. We see there are lowerings of the barriers to trade, tariffs, taxes, quotas, and even capital controls, which is the flow of money coming in and out of your country. Especially in the 80s, especially as part of that Washington Consensus, there was this expectation that you would not put restrictions on the flow of capital in and out of your country. And restrictions on capital, that's what capital controls are. You had philosophically the rise of neoliberalism, which saw that national prosperity, your wealth as a nation, is actually threatened by the addition to the cost of production that is inherent in taxation and regulation. So you needed to get rid of regulation as much as you can. You need to lower taxation as much as you can. So essentially then, technological progress, the end of communism, and deregulation are the three trends that have increased the acceleration of globalization in recent decades.